Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Korea This Week. I'm your host, Sang Kim, and today we have Troy Stangarone, KEI's Senior Director and Fellow with us. Thank you so much for joining us, Troy.
Thanks for having me, Sang.
Great. Well, I hope everyone had a great weekend. There were a couple of events that happened last Friday that we cannot not talk about it. So
we're talking about the Indiana conference I went to, right?
Yes, that too. And then the Nationals game. So let's start with the two major events that happened last Friday. So one is that I'm sure you heard after our Korea Korea This Week last week that North Korea wants to remove South Korean built buildings, especially at the Mount Kumgang area. And of course that started some conversation within South Korean government as well. So let's start with that first. So North Korea wants those South Korean built operations gone in Mount Kumgang, which started in 1998, and it was in business for about 10 years, and then of course it was suspended in 2008 when a South Korean tourist was shot and killed by the North Korean soldier. Okay, so with that in the background, and Kim Jong-un wants to get rid of those facilities. So Troy, why now? Out of all these times,
the timing is interesting. Clearly the nuclear talks aren't really going anywhere, but on the other hand, North Korea has largely over the last few months kind of cut South Korea out of everything, refused to talk to them. There haven't been meetings at the liaison offices in Kaesong really at all much of this year. So it is an interesting situation. There's speculation that they're trying to place pressure on South Korea. Though that being said, I think it's hard to argue that President Moon isn't trying to take and facilitate this process. So it is a bit perplexing. You also have a lot of discussion right now about I think it was Kim Jong-chol came out and said essentially like that, while Kim Jong-un has a good relationship with President Trump, you shouldn't take that for granted, and we have to finish this all by the end of this year. And so, some of this seems to be driven by North Korea's own timelines, but at the same time, there's only been 8 days of talks over the last 18 months, and it's not because the United States or South Korea haven't wanted to meet. So it's perplexing in that sense because North Korea has actually been the obstacle to talks in all of this. And so if Kim Jong-un is really trying to pressure South Korea or trying to pressure the United States to move this along, I mean, the best advice I think one could give him is actually have his negotiators negotiate, rather than threatening to take and tear down buildings and things.
Right. So when I first saw the alert, it made a very initial reaction was that I thought they were going to literally destroy the building unilaterally, but later report came said that they want South Koreans to come to North Korea and just dismantle it themselves, and they are willing to negotiate over documents, not actually meetings. So how does the South Korean government feel about this? I mean, I'm sure they're not happy.
No, yeah, and I mean, they've counterproposed. They have suggested that they have meetings to discuss this issue. Hyundai Asan has said that they would be willing to join those meetings to talk about it because clearly, as the nominal proprietor, they have a clear interest in the future of the facilities and everything. But at the same time, it's unclear. Is North Korea going to pay South Korea to, remove these facilities? Is North Korea going to reimburse South Korea for the investment they made into North Korea? It might be one thing if North Korea wants to rebuild the facility. Kim Jong-un talked about making them more modern and seemingly, I guess, more in a style that he might prefer. But, there are these types of questions out there because, in essence, what he's doing is he is seizing South Korean property, and he's not offering compensation at all, at least from what we can tell at this point.
Right. So let's say, in a hypothetical situation, that South Korean companies and the government officials do go to North Korea, try to dismantle the facility. Like, would that be in any violation of any sanctions?
I mean, most of the things that are sanctioned would be things like the transfer of funds or materials, specifically prohibited materials, to them. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any sanction that it would violate. But that being said, I think it's a clear sign that there are challenges in inter-Korean relations going forward. It's also unclear. Kim Jong-un had said in his remarks that basically, or he sort of implied that North Korea should be running these types of things. That North Korea shouldn't be dependent on foreigners for its own economy. But I mean, we talk a lot about the inter-Korean side of this, but the question here is, President Trump has said that there's a bright future for North Korea, but that bright future that he envisions is dependent upon, in essence, significant foreign investment in North Korea, and to be honest, significant technical know-how in helping them to take and make changes they would need to really get the economy going. And so if Kim Jong-un is really going to pursue a path of going it alone, this isn't just simply a problem for South Korean engagement, but it also raises questions about what can be done in the nuclear talks, because there's going to have to be some type of economic cooperation if you really want that to move forward.
So I mean, the Mount Kumgang resort was something that President Moon and also Chairman Kim had talked about and possibly restarting when they met last year. And of course, President Moon has the peace initiative that he's been talking about during the UN General Assembly meeting, and also he probably mentioned it during ASEAN summit to really get support for moving forward with inter-Korean relations. So what do you think how this will impact, and also how can South Korea can kind of resolve this issue and kind of move forward?
Well, I think there's a few impacts. One, President Moon had invited Kim Jong-un to the upcoming ASEAN summit. It's not impossible, but it seems less likely now that Kim Jong-un would attend that, even though there were questions about whether he would come to begin with.
Right.
Two, as I mentioned, this is essentially the expropriation of South Korean property, so that's a negative impact. I think right now, until we get progress on denuclearization, it's going to be hard for a lot of these types of projects to move forward. And so I think, there really needs to be emphasis, especially on the North Korean side, like I was saying, on, coming back to talks and trying to take and find a solution going forward. But the other part of this is, if we think about this long term, if North Korea actually follows through and does this, you'll now have the precedent of basically Orascom, the Egyptian telecoms company that had built the original 3G network in North Korea, who has not been allowed to take and expropriate its profits back to Egypt where it's based. Two, has largely saw the state create a state-based competitor to take away what it thought was going to be an exclusive market. You have the experience of Chinese companies who've had facilities expropriated. You'll now have, Kaesong, where this, or not Kaesong, but Kumgang, where this will have happened. So this is actually really sending a bad signal to the international business community that North Korea isn't a reliable partner or a place for investment. So even once you get past, if we were able to do the issue, dismantling North Korea's nuclear weapons and come to some kind of peace agreement, you have this challenge of that, North Korea really has to make a lot of changes to improve its business environment. How do we get beyond that? I think if I were Kim Jong-un, it might be one thing to engage in South Korea if there's improvements he'd like to see made to the facilities, because, they haven't been used other than for family reunions, which is something that would be good if they were to restart as well. But, beyond that, since, as you mentioned, we've had, this South Korean tourist who was killed, they have been used. So maybe there's a case for saying, how do we refurbish? How do we, re-energize this facility? But it all needs to be within the context of when the timing is right, when we have made steps in progress on denuclearization. So I don't think there's problems with sort of planning for the future, but the future needs to be held within the context of when it'll be possible.
Right. So it was just this morning, Monday, that South Korean government had officially said they wanted a working level talk. So we'll have to wait for response from North Korea, and I'm sure we'll hear about it in the news in the coming days. Next, I want to switch gear and talk about South Korea and its developing country status. So last Friday, the South Korean finance minister said that South Korea will no longer seek special treatment as a developing country while further negotiation of WTO. But he did also add that he's not officially giving up South Korea's status as a developing country. So it's a little vague and confusing there. But Troy, first I want to ask you, so the status of South Korea's developing country status has been, brought up before, right? As early as 96, the year after they joined WTO. So what prompted South Korea to make official statement just now?
I mean, this is coming forward now because of pressure from President Trump. Since he's come to office, he has been very focused on what he views as unfair trading practices of U.S. trading partners. He'll often talk about this in terms of the trade deficit, but ultimately, South Korea for a while now has been one of the world's largest economies. You have advanced companies like Samsung, and so he's raising the question of whether a country that has, the world's 12th largest economy, that has, modern day advanced internationally competitive industries is really a developing economy anymore. And so that's sort of what's been pushing this forward, along with maybe one of the challenges of the WTO itself, which is that there isn't actually a defined definition of what a developing economy is, and it's self-declared.
Right.
And so in some ways, President Trump is saying, why should people be able to self-declare something when maybe they don't qualify well for that?
Right. So in talking about qualification, there's 4 criteria that's set by the U.S. government officials that defines the development country, which is still vague. But so what are the 4s and how does South Korea fit into those?
So one is that you're a member of the G20. There are probably decent arguments there, but there are a couple countries or so, maybe you can make an argument that they're large economies, but they're large because, say like India, where there's still large amounts of poverty and everything, you maybe make a case that they're still developing. You have members of the OECD, and because essentially, the OECD is a collection of the world's developed economies, it's hard to really argue that somebody maybe in the OECD shouldn't be one. Also, one standard is countries that meet the qualifications of the World Bank for being considered a high-income country. And then lastly are countries that make up about 0.5% of global trade. It's not quite clear how they came up with that. That seems somewhat arbitrary. But the first 3, I think you can kind of see straightforward. And, South Korea isn't the only country that this would affect. You're talking about countries also like Singapore, Taiwan, China itself, is obviously clearly somebody that, the Trump administration is looking at. So, this isn't just about South Korea, but South Korea is really kind of one of the first to sort of step forward.
Right. So, clearly there are also benefits of being declared, or benefits for declaring your country as a developing country. So, what are some of the special treatments that countries get under WTO? So,
in sort of a general sense, there's more time and flexibility for implementing new rules. Sometimes you have more ability to provide, government subsidies. You also have a right to things like technical assistance for reforming. But, for South Korea specifically, the real advantage for maintaining the status is not about a lot of the companies that we might think of. It's about the South Korean agricultural sector, which is largely still rural. It's also still in small plots. It's underdeveloped. There's been a lot of effort to try and transition it from sort of commodity type things like rice to higher value vegetables and fruits, things like bell peppers or something. But this has really been about sort of, protecting South Korean farmers who, aren't necessarily set up to take and, on the one hand, deal with international competition, but on the other hand, if you look at South Korea's experience under, for example, like the Chorus FTA, there was all this concern about that the South Korean agriculture would be wiped out, and we haven't seen that happen. Right. And actually, in beef, one area where there was the biggest concern, the challenges the South Korean cattle industry has faced haven't been really from the United States, but they actually became overly aggressive in raising new cattle, and that created oversupply, which then obviously reduced price and put a lot of people in a difficult situation. So this has been largely about agriculture, but I also think it's something where there's probably a realization that there's other steps that could maybe be taken as well.
Right. So the finance minister emphasized that this will not affect any of the existing agreement, but it will impact the future negotiations. So how do you see this impacting South Korea's trade relations? I know South Korea has a lot of free trade agreements with a lot of countries, but obviously it probably wants to expand more and more. But how would this impact the future negotiation?
So, if you look at, for example, relations with the United States, rice is excluded from KORUS. At some point I could see pressure for that to change, especially depending on how Korea handles rice in its other negotiations. When you look at sort of regional agreements, I realize right now it's hard to imagine a time when Korea, because of the tensions with Japan, would join the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Partnership for Trans-Pacific Trade, Comprehensive and Progressive Partnership for Trans-Pacific Trade. At some point, South Korea is most likely going to be looking to join that as well. And, in some ways this might help because agriculture is going to have to be something that's going to be on the table. And, now by moving this off, maybe it'll make it politically easier to take and really maybe negotiate on this. So you'll see it in things like that. I think at this point, there's a lot of other negotiations out there, but they're either one with, more developing economies to where, maybe this won't be as big of an issue, or two, they're, for example, like the trilateral FTA with China and Japan, which I don't think is going anywhere anytime soon, or RCEP, which for different reasons, because it's going to be very difficult to get an agreement with India that all the other countries can agree to, it's going to be hard. So I really think, for the immediate future, this probably won't change much, but maybe, 5 years down the road or so, when some of the politics has changed and other things, we might start seeing some of the implications of this.
Right. Well, so that's all we have for today. Obviously, the two major issues that concerning Korea this week and coming days. So thank you so much for your insight. I do want to plug two upcoming KEI program. This Friday, we have a book event with Seth Berkman on the recent Pyeongchang Olympic and the joint women's hockey team. So so we'll be hosting him and his book events this noon, and also tomorrow KEI is traveling to Greater Hampton Roads area in Virginia. So if you are in the area, we'll be hosting a main event tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. I believe, but we'll share the more information on the comment section. With that, thank you so much for watching. Is there anything else you want to add? Just,
as a National League fan, looking forward to the Nets, maybe hoping to go back to Houston. And, they won the 2 games in Houston. Houston won all 3 here in D.C. So if there's a pattern, they should win the last 2 games in Houston, hopefully. But, just a little bit of sports. Right. I mean, it's a very exciting time for D.C. So we really do hope to have that championship this year. So with that, we'll conclude now, and then also we'll see you next week. Thank you. Thank you.